Hey guys, today we're going to be learning about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And when we talk about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we're basically talking about Great Britain because that's where it started. And the dates for this are sometime from the end of the 1700s towards sometime in the middle of the 1800s. Exactly when is unimportant. I'm going to go ahead and say 1760 to 1840. Here are your questions. Okay, so around 1780, things really start to take off in Great Britain. And basically, from this time forward, life in Great Britain is totally different than it had been before. And so a lot of people seem to think that the Industrial Revolution is just kind of a matter of some new inventions, stuff like railroads and factories and stuff like that. But it's really more complicated. It's not just a story of the technology. In fact, the necessary technology for the Industrial Revolution, all the stuff that they're actually using, had actually been around since the Scientific Revolution. Britain is special not because of its advanced technology, but because of the advanced ways that it uses the technology. And so to explain why all this stuff happens in Britain, we actually need to look at a number of things. We need to look at geographic factors, political and cultural factors, economic factors, and also technological factors. So all of these combine to result in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is basically a snowball effect of increasing production and growth. So one breakthrough in production leads to more and more productivity and further breakthroughs. And it's only after the Industrial Revolution really gets started in England that it spreads to the rest of Europe in the later 1800s. Alright, so let's get started by talking about the geographic factors that made England a perfect place for the Industrial Revolution to begin. First of all, England was a densely populated island with lots of rivers and canals. And this was important for two reasons. One, it protected England from invasions. And what this meant is that because Britain was safe from invasions from other countries, it was able to spend more of its national wealth on trade and industry. As you guys already know, England invested heavily in its navy, and a navy is useful not only for protecting an island, but also for expanding trade around the world. So Great Britain didn't have to invest in a huge army like Germany or France did, so it was able to invest more of its money in trade and industry. Also, the fact that it was a small island made it really easy to transport goods. And basically the reason transport is so important for industrialization is factories don't really make any sense unless you can transport the stuff that you make in the factory to the people who want to buy it. And back in the 1700s, this was pretty difficult because there weren't cars, there weren't railroads. So the only real efficient way to transport stuff from a factory was to transport it on water. And one fact that really makes this very clear is that before the invention of railroads, it cost as much money to ship stuff all the way across the Atlantic Ocean as it cost to ship stuff 30 miles across land. But so fortunately for England, there was no place that was more than 30 miles away from a river, canal, or port. And this meant that stuff that was produced anywhere in England could be shipped almost anywhere in the world simply by taking it downriver and shipping it across the ocean. And yeah. The other important geographic factor that influenced the development of industry in Great Britain was that it had accessible coal deposits. So coal is a very widely available fossil fuel, and it's kind of a hard black rock, in case you don't know, that can be burned at very high temperatures. And the reason coal had become important in England was not because of the Industrial Revolution, but because by 1700, almost all of the trees in England had been cut down. And so because they'd cut down all the trees, English people needed a new source to keep warm in the winter. And so they burned coal in their houses instead of trees. But so coal would later become incredibly important because it would be burned to power the machines that would run the English factories. So accessible coal and access to navigable water routes were the two important geographic factors for Great Britain. Another important economic factor was the development of agriculture in Great Britain. And so basically the reason agriculture is so important is without really efficient agriculture, you can't support big cities. Because for every person in the city, you need food to be produced in the countryside that can feed that person, because that person in the city is not actually growing their own food. And this happens in Britain during the century before the Industrial Revolution, from 1700 to 1800. And there are three main things that lead to a huge increase in agricultural output. One is this movement called enclosure, which is basically a tendency for rich English landlords to buy up all of the land and to kick poorer peasants off of the land. What this means is that all of the agricultural lands that were kind of shared by poorer peasants are now owned by a single wealthy farmer who seeks to use that land to make as much money as possible. This is, of course, not so good for the poor farmers, but it's really good for England in general because it results in much more efficient agricultural production, because the rich farmers can use the land more efficiently than all of the small farmers before. Second is Britain kind of has a breakthrough in livestock breeding. Basically, they learned that if you mate the biggest cow with the other biggest cow, they're going to have big babies. They basically figure out evolution before Charles Darwin comes around. And so you see a huge increase in the size of important livestock animals like cows and sheep. And this makes agriculture much more efficient. And finally, they figure out a system of crop rotation and fodder crops. And this is kind of complicated, but basically the idea is that some crops that you can feed to your animals, like clover, actually make the soil better. They return nutrients to the soil over time. So what farmers figure out is they're going to grow normal crops like wheat on half of their fields, and on the other half of their fields they're going to grow fodder crops like clover that actually make their soil better. This leads to better soil, but also it allows the farmers to support more livestock because they can feed the clover to their animals. And this means you have richer soil and more animals. And one thing that more animals means is more manure, aka fertilizer. So they can use this manure from the animals to fertilize their fields, which means there's even more stuff produced on these fields. And basically it's just this feedback loop that results in a huge increase in productivity on English lands because there's more fertilizer and more animals. And so the end result of these three big agricultural breakthroughs was a huge growth in agricultural production and then a huge growth in population because more food equals more babies. And so by 1800, England's population had almost doubled from 5 million to 9 million. This meant that there wasn't really enough room in the countryside, especially because the rich farmers were kicking the poor farmers off of their land. So there was a huge flood of poor English into the cities. And what this meant is there was lots of cheap labor in the cities to work in factories. And this leads into the next big change we're going to talk about. Well, maybe not exactly the next change, because what we're going to talk about right now is the British access to the world market. So as we've already mentioned, Britain had a huge navy, and this meant that it could basically trade all over the world. And so because they could trade all over the world, if Britain learned how to make stuff really well, which it would do during the Industrial Revolution, it would mean that it could sell all of its stuff all around the world. And so this meant that Britain basically had an unlimited demand for the stuff that it made. On top of this, Britain already had a capitalist tradition in which rich people in England would invest their money in order to make more money. That is, if maybe you inherited $10,000 rather than having a party or building a big mansion, what a British person would do is they would use that $10,000 to buy a ship and turn that $10,000 into $20,000 over time by using that ship to trade and make money. Or later on, they would use that $10,000 to build a factory. and turn that $10,000 into maybe $1 million. So the idea is that they would use their money to generate more money. And this was a tradition that dated way back in England and that was still going strong when the Industrial Revolution started. And finally, and perhaps the most important for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, was the textile industry. Basically, everybody in the world wears clothes. And so because Britain had access to the world market, if it could learn to make clothes cheaply and well, it could sell an infinite number of clothes all over the world. And so we're going to see in the next slide how the cotton textiles industry kind of begins the Industrial Revolution and kicks off this snowball effect of economic growth. Okay, so the key breakthroughs in England from 1760 to 1800, kind of the first stage of the revolution, are three big things. One is the factory system. And so this is not so much a technology, but a change in the way labor is organized. So as we mentioned in the last slideshow, a lot of basic materials, like clothes, were actually made before the Industrial Revolution by peasants themselves. And this is an old-fashioned system called the putting out system, where basically people make stuff in their homes. This is replaced by the factory system in Britain, where basically instead of people making stuff in their homes, all the workers are gathered together. And complex tasks are broken down into more simple tasks, which means that unskilled people can work together to create one complicated thing. It's like one person will wash the wool, and one person will spin the wool, and one person will weave the wool, and one person will sew the wool into a shirt. And so all of this together makes for a huge increase in production, even with less skilled laborers. On top of the factory system, we see the beginning of mechanization. And mechanization is basically where you invent machines to replace human beings at certain jobs. And the first place where you see widespread mechanization is in the production of textiles, aka cotton and wool cloth. And so you see machines called stuff like the water frame, the spinning jenny, and the power loom that take over old-time human tasks like spinning cotton into thread and then weaving the cotton into cloth, and instead these machines do it faster and more effectively. What this does is it vastly increases the amount of cotton and wool cloth that can be made in a single factory, and this decreases the price of all of this stuff, and then it can be sold all over the world. These machines are originally powered either by hand, by horses, or by water, but they'll later be replaced by steam power, which is the third important breakthrough of the early Industrial Revolution. So the steam engine that really kind of became efficient and effective was James Watt's steam engine, which was invented around 1775. And basically what this machine does is it burns coal to boil water, and then this water is used, or this boiling water is used to create a piston full of pressurized steam. And this will move the piston because the pressure forces the piston up, and this pushes a crank arm that can turn a wheel. And the turning of this wheel can then be used to power any number of machines. Originally, this technology was used to pump water out of coal mines, because remember, coal was important for heating people's houses in deforested England. But later it was used to power all sorts of industrial machines, including the textile machines that we just talked about. And so the combination of steam power and machines in factories leads to basically like almost an infinite increase in the amount of cotton cloth that can be made in England. And then some later breakthroughs that happen in England, kind of from 1800 to 1850, are, one, there's a breakthrough, that's my dog Zeus. There's a breakthrough in transportation. And basically what happens here is they take the steam engine and apply it to transportation technology. And the two things we see come out of this are railroads and steamships. And both of these methods drastically increase the speed of travel, and therefore they increase the speed of trade and communication, which boosts production, because if you can't transport stuff, then there's no reason to make it in a factory. So better transportation means more efficient factories. And finally, you see a mass production of iron. And this is huge because it transforms basically every aspect of society. Before mass production of iron, iron was a very rare and precious metal. Afterwards, iron is cheap and common and can be used for everything. It can be used for furniture, it can be used for bridges and buildings, not just for tools and stuff like that. And so the thing that causes the mass production of iron is a huge investment in railroads, because railroads require tons and tons of iron. So this vast investment in railroads leads to new techniques that leads to increasingly efficient iron production. New tools powered by steam make it easier to work with iron. Stuff like steam hammers can produce new types of iron products. And because of this, iron becomes cheap and plentiful and leads to advances in construction and engineering and in all sorts of other economic areas. As a result of all of this, by 1840, the combination of the factory system, the mechanized production, the steam power, advances in transportation, and world trade, all of this together had totally transformed the British economy. And it had transformed the economy in both positive and negative ways. On the positive side, Britain becomes the leading producer in the world. Tiny little Britain, biggest producer in the world of textiles, coal, and iron. And Britain is now able to sell textiles, coal, and iron all around the globe. And it can bring back natural resources that it needs for its factories, but it can also bring back huge profits to the factory owners who are making all of this stuff. And so Britain becomes incredibly wealthy and has a greater productive capacity than any other nation in the world. But on the negative side, we see rapid unplanned urbanization, which leads to disease, slums, and pollution. We see inequality, where poor Britons don't really have the money to invest in factories, so they can't see any of these profits. So almost all of the profits go to a small number of rich investors. And finally, it leads to a lot of suffering for the new urban working classes, who are forced to work long hours in dangerous factories for minimal wages, barely enough to keep themselves alive. And so the Industrial Revolution makes Britain very powerful, but it also leads to new social problems that it has to deal with in some way. Thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging in there. I know this has been a long video, but the Industrial Revolution is super important and pretty complicated, as I'm sure you have now realized.